This is not a topic I normally have to deal with. Few groups hold to the idea today that Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea. But this raises another interesting question. Who exactly died in the Red Sea on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible? After the Israelites left Egypt, they passed through Sukkoth and Pithom and exited out of the Wadi Tumilat. Once they left the Wadi Tumilat, they could have gone directly south, making good their escape. But they don't do this. Instead, they traveled north, where they wandered between Pi-Hahirot, Baal-Zephon, Migdol, and the sea. Agents from the Egyptian outposts returned to the king with a report that Israelites were wandering aimlessly in the wilderness. Exodus 14:1. The king mounts his chariot and sends out his 600 best chariots and gathers other chariots along the way, giving chase to the Israelites. Exodus 14:7. Soon, the chariots had overtaken the Israelites. Exodus 14:9. The Egyptians have the Israelites dead to rights. But a pillar of cloud and fire is the only thing that separates the two camps all through the night. Exodus 14:20. That night, a strong wind came from the east and parts the waters, and the Israelites cross the Sea of Reeds. Exodus 14:21-22. Pharaoh's chariots follow after, but the chariot wheels, which were designed to be easily pulled out of dry sand, cut deep into the mud, get stuck, and swerve. Exodus 14:25. Finally, the wind subsides and the waters close in, drowning Pharaoh and his entire army. Right? After all, Exodus 14:17 reads, quote, "And as for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go in after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen." End quote. This would seem to suggest that Pharaoh and all his armies were destroyed in the Red Sea. And someone who is not careful about reading the text might conclude that. But the text is more complicated than that. The fact is, if we read the text carefully, we will quickly notice that not everyone in Egypt's army was destroyed in the Red Sea. This is even suggested by the wording of the text itself. Even the use of the term army is rather complicated. Like many words in Hebrew, it has a broad semantic range. It can mean strength, efficiency, wealth, or army. So in this context, the word could mean either army or strength. Either meaning is possible here. Next, the word is used in the singular. So the aspect of the text connotes that it was either the army of Pharaoh sent out, but not necessarily all of Pharaoh's army. Even Exodus 14:28 states, quote, "Even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them," end quote, has a restricted clause that limits who was destroyed to only those who entered the Red Sea. Therefore, we need to determine who was actually present at the Red Sea debacle to see who died and who survived. First, we need to recognize that only the chariots were sent out. while Exodus 14:5 seems to imply that Pharaoh was conducting a slave retrieval operation when he says, quote, "What is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" End quote. He does an action that is inconsistent with that goal. The infantry was not sent out immediately after the chariots. At the very least, the chariots are given a substantial head start. He sends out his 600 best chariots, and his officers in the Egyptian army were all charioteers. And this comes out of Exodus 14:7. If the point of Pharaoh's revenge was to recapture the Israelites, he would have sent out the infantry with their slaver poles to bind and capture the Israelites. The point of sending out the chariots first was that their mission was not necessarily to capture, but to kill or at least greatly reduce the number of Israelites. Essentially, kill as many Israelites first to reduce their numbers so that perhaps the infantry could come in later and sort of pick out the stragglers who would then be carried back to serve. But the Egyptian armies did not capture slaves with chariots. They used the infantry for this purpose. And the infantry, at the very best, was lagging very far behind by the time the chariots catch up to the Israelites. So that makes the infantry at best non-participants in this particular combat. Second, not all of Egypt's chariots were destroyed. Ramses II had a chariot division garrisoned in El Alamein in the west to protect Egypt from the Libyans. The divisions from Paramses, Charu, and Migdol were probably sent, accounting for probably 3/4 of Egypt's chariots. Not to diminish the defeat in any way, but the destruction of 3/4 of Egypt's chariots was more than enough to cripple Egypt's ability to campaign effectively. Third, also absent from the Reed Sea debacle was Pharaoh himself. Very few conservative scholars today would claim that Pharaoh drowned. We find this notion as part of the traditional Jewish Seder, but that's not found in Scripture. It is also affirmed by Islamic tradition in the Quran. Now, we have the mummies of the leading candidates for the Exodus Pharaoh: Ramses II, Amenhotep II, Tutmosis III, and others. Not a single mummy from a pharaoh shows evidence of drowning. Given that the water came crashing in on Pharaoh's chariots, we would expect that the dead would have lacerations and sand in their nose and mouth. None of these indications appear on any royal mummy. So where does this idea that Pharaoh drowned originate? It comes from a misunderstanding of Psalm 136:15. Quote, "He overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, for his loving kindness is everlasting." End quote. What we have in English versions of this psalm is a traditional rendering. Translators often use traditional readings because there are some translations that people get very upset over if you use a correct modern translation. This is why we still see in our Bibles Red Sea instead of Reed Sea and mercy seat instead of lid. The Hebrew verb in Psalm 136:15 is na'ar, which means to throw off or shake off. The idea is that Pharaoh and his army are so insignificant that God just brushes them off without a thought. But it is the traditional rendering to read this as overthrow. But that is an unfortunate and misleading translation. The fact is that there is no indication in the Bible that the king of Egypt drowned in the Red Sea. So what happened to Pharaoh after the Red Sea debacle? Well, he lived another 40 years, reigning for a total of 66 years. God cursed Pharaoh with a very long life. And when I mean cursed, when a monarch rules for a long time, like what has happened to the reigns of Queen Elizabeth II and Pepi II, the dynasty grows weak. Already early in Ramses II's reign, Philistines had begun a takeover of the cities of Canaan's coastal plain. For example, the Tanis II rhetorical stela, Kitchen's Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2, page 290, and the North Stela at Nahi al-Kab, Kitchen's Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2, page 11, dated to regnal year 5, mentions the Sherdan had already settled in Canaan. And the Battle of Kadesh inscriptions also mentioned that the Luca had already entered into the land. Kenneth Kitchen's Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2, page 17. Yet, Ramses II, without his chariots, was not able to maintain control over the coastal plain of Canaan through military campaigns. And his last campaign was in regnal year 17, just a few years before the Exodus. And in Egypt's weakened state, Ramses II's successor, Merneptah, had difficulty repelling an invasion from the Libyans, who occupied the Nile Delta for months, reaching as far inland as Heliopolis. Then after Merneptah's 10-year reign, there was a series of coups and turmoil over who succeeded him, leading to a fall of Dynasty 19. That turmoil, combined with the late Bronze Age collapse, opened the opportunity for Israelites to establish themselves. Anyway, I hope you found that video interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.